So I'd like to welcome Wayne. Hi, Wayne. I'm so pleased you could join us today. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Can you all hear me okay? Good. I haven't prepared a presentation for this. I'm just going to talk about sprinklers in one respect, and just to expand a little bit more on the building control that Heather's just talked about. So part of that building control process in there currently is the requirement for us to be consulted as the fire authority. So it's not, or there's a legal requirement to be consulted, whatever we say in our recommendations when we look at the plans, or the passing of plans that we look at in respect to fire safety and the fire safety provisions in the building. Unfortunately, our voice is not to be listened to, as in that you must do this. It's more of a recommendation. Purely at that planning stage is where we look at the plans and we can make observations, and we pass those back to the approved inspector or the local authority building control officer about some concerns or some issues that we may identify. And then it's up to really those, if they listen to us or if they agree with us, or sometimes it can go to a dispute or even a discussion. But ultimately, they don't have to take our word for whatever we highlight. Most of the time, thankfully, they do listen, and we do work together, more particularly local authority building control, because as soon as that building then becomes occupied and the project is finished, that's when the fire safety order applies. And if there are significant issues in regards to the build of and the safety of the residents or occupants of that building, then we can then serve enforcement notices. We can go in and enforce under the fire safety legislation, and in some respects may even prohibit the use of the building or even part of the building. So we do have a good working relationship most of the time, although we do get the odd one or two disagreements which can extend as well. But obviously part of that negotiation and certainly discussion around the plans is very well received. So we don't normally get any problems as such. When it comes to sprinklers, when we get consulted on plans, whether it's mostly residential buildings will be multi-occupied residential buildings. We do get consulted on housing developments. We only really comment on building regulation B5, which is fire service access and facilities. And generally there's some requirements around access for fire appliances, water supplies, those sort of things in single private domestic dwellings. And that's because the fire safety order doesn't apply in a single private domestic dwelling. It only really applies in multi-occupied buildings. And more importantly, it just affects common areas. Although recently now we've had the publication of the Fire Safety Act 2021, which brings a little more clarification around external wall systems and flat front doors, which is more in the scope of the Fire Safety Order rather than the Housing Act. So we can enforce on those issues. And I know we've talked a lot around today about external wall systems and certainly standards of multi-occupied buildings. But obviously now we've got clarification on where we can enforce in regards to the fire safety order. So the plans we get really just going on from that for multi-occupied buildings are more for means of escape and the fire safety measures, particularly on the size of the building, depending on the floor layout, how many floors is involved in the building, and obviously the stipulation with the appropriate design guides. So one is approved document B, which is the most commonly used design guide for fire safety with regards to building regulations. Previously, it used to be 18 metres height for sprinklers to be provided in residential buildings, or any building really over 18 metres high had to have a provision of sprinklers. On the back of Grenfell and the Grenfell Tower inquiry, and quite a lot of negotiations and push from the the National Fire Chiefs Council and the National Fire Sprinkler Association. A lot of lobbying in government. That's now been brought down to 11 metres, which is good. It certainly involves a lot more buildings, potentially above 4 stories high. Residential buildings would now be provided with sprinkler protection. Unfortunately, that doesn't cover retrospective fitting. It's just for new builds only. However, if there is a building that is going to be refurbished in some way or some material change, then that brings into the scope of building regulations, and then there would be a requirement to fit a sprinkler system in that respect. But personally, I don't think that would be a common occurrence. So with regards to domestic, single private domestic dwellings, there's no requirement for sprinkler systems to be provided in those types of buildings in England. Obviously, Wales, back in 2011, they changed their legislation, and now they have all buildings, all residential buildings must be provided with a sprinkler system from 2011, which is good. And I don't know if that's going to happen in England. I'd like to see that happen in England because I think it's a really good idea. Sprinkler protection, it's good. There's quite a lot of advantages for fitting a sprinkler system, in residential premises. It can certainly save a lot of cost, reduce deaths, injuries from fires, and prevent that fire from spreading, particularly in multi-occupied buildings where you've got stay-put policies in place, and obviously certain residents that aren't always going to be or have that ability to escape from the residential dwelling. The size of the fire is reduced as well, so certainly within the compartment itself where a sprinkler system is installed, it can reduce the fire growth and confine that to one compartment only, and not spread across the whole of the ground floor or even the upper floors if there are any there as well. So life savability and property protection is saved and limited, and also the environment protects the environment as well. So obviously the fire size is reduced, the smoke that's produced is limited, and the fire can be the fire intervention can be made a lot sooner as well. It also makes our job a little bit easier as well when we're responding to fires. We're not turning up to a building fire that's involving multiple floors and quite the fire's got to the point where it's expanded and compromised the compartmentation within the building. So then we can focus on our resources on just a smaller fire rather than big fires that we see on the news, which is really good. We do have a sprinkler strategy. So part of our, touching back on the building control process, in all of our letters that we send to our responses that we send to the passing of plans, one of our recommendations is obviously to fit a sprinkler system. But unfortunately, to my knowledge, I don't think that's ever happened. I think it's more of a cost. I think that is, there's no legal requirement, and the cost of it is probably more of a deterrent than actual the cost of maybe saving somebody's life or certainly reducing the impact of a fire within a building, which is disappointing. So I think for me personally going forward, I think if that was a legislative requirement, then it would certainly reduce the impact. Just talking about as well what Heather touched on, we do work closely with our local authority building control. We've had in the past, I think it was a couple of years ago, sort of pre-COVID, we had a sprinkler forum, a seminar where we invited lots of local businesses, housing associations to come along, and we got several guest speakers in to talk about their experiences of sprinkler systems, their advantages, and all the good things that they can provide, which really went down really well. The better business for all, I think, was one of the involvement in there, and obviously the local businesses as well that came along. Unfortunately, COVID hit, and we've not really done anything like that since. It's something, once we can see, coming out of this COVID situation, returning back to some sort of normality, that's something that we are going to pick up again and look to spread that out across the county again, and organise more events where we can look at influencing local businesses and housing associations to have a look at the sprinkler provision and maybe promote that across the county. National Fire Chiefs Council are big advocates of sprinkler protection, not just in residential buildings but commercial buildings as well, purely because of the information that's out there. There's a vast range of information out there around sprinkler systems and how good they can perform. And obviously, when you've got a sprinkler system, you can take that holistic fire risk assessment review of the building and reduce the risk of fire from occurring in the building quite dramatically. I don't know if there's anything else that I need to talk about, but
Wayne, that's so interesting. Thank you very, very much. I've got, as an architect, I remember taking plans into the fire department office on opposite King Parker's Piece. Do designers still come into you and talk through schemes before and at an early stage, do you find?
Not. Sometimes we'll get some correspondence, so pre-consultation from approved inspectors. So depending on the size of the project, we will get some pre-consultation. So yeah, that does happen. And what we have as well is that our fire safety inspectors across the county, they have liaisons and meetings with our local authority building control officers. So in the different districts, they have regular meetings and updates where they can discuss different projects that are ongoing and ask for that advice as well. So if they've got a particular concern, they can discuss that and look at reasonable resolutions as well, or reasonable or other solutions that may be a lot easier. In my experience, it's always better to do it at the design stage rather than when the building's built and then you've got problems. It's going to be more expensive and more hassle to retrospectively change any areas of concern.
Yeah. Tumi, do you want to come in, and then Heather, and Sam and Katie? Tumi?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Wayne, for that presentation. I was intrigued to hear that you, in your letter, back to applicants passing the plans for their buildings, that you recommend that sprinklers are installed, but to your knowledge, none has ever been installed. Now, any idea what the costs, say for an average, I don't know, 3-story, or not 3-story, 3-bedroom house will be? And if that is if the cost is a potential reason, are there ways that could be mitigated? I don't know.
Yeah, in my opinion, I believe the cost could be absorbed in the build, certainly for the dwelling. But I think on average, a domestic system, depending on the spec, an average 3-bedroom house, you're probably looking around £3,000 to £9,000. So your 3,000 would be your basic sort of installation, and also the top spec, you're looking at probably 9,000. So it's pretty much the same as anything else. You put a standard size system, and so if you went for a medium or a mid-range size system, £5,000, I think you can't put a price on life safety. Your normal domestic smoke detector requirements, so one at the bottom of the stairs and one at the top of the stairs. You're relying on people closing the bedroom doors at night. You're relying on people unplugging electrical items and switching things off in the kitchen. Generally doesn't happen. We're all guilty of that. So to have that added protection of a sprinkler system, I think in my mind it's a necessity.
Yeah. Okay. It just seems. I mean, I know that for for example, for rental properties, there's a requirement for, mains linked fire alarms, which you have to put in.
Yeah.
But perhaps that could be linked with a sprinkler system, just in case. I mean, number of properties that one sees with, you see that it's been smoke damaged or fire damaged, could really be reduced, and of course, more people will be able to potentially survive such incidents.
Yeah, exactly. The smoke does more damage than the fire, actually. And it's the smoke that's going to obviously, unfortunately, take people's lives than the fire. Hence why compartmentation is a very serious issue that we need to take seriously. And when we look at inspecting buildings, multi-occupied buildings, so blocks of flats, it's where the state put strategies in place. The compartmentation and the alarm system need to support that, because if you don't have that compartmentation, someone that feels like they're safe to stay in their own flat while there's a flat fire going on next door, may not necessarily be safe. So hence why our inspections are really important. And that's something that we are looking at as well, certainly with high-rise inspections at the moment.
Thank you.
Yeah, interestingly, the fire detection in flats, the minimum requirement is an LD3, and you're right, it's connected to the mains powered. So the LD3 means that just all you need is one smoke detector in the means of escape.
Yeah.
So Heather, or yes, Katie, Sam? Oh, Katie.
Oh, thanks very much. So that was really interesting. Thank you. Yeah, and as I'm assuming it's a lot more expensive to retrofit a sprinkler than to build it as the building's going up. And I was also going to ask, obviously, one of the major changes we're having, quite rightly, is we're moving much more towards eco-friendly houses. So, passive house, we're losing gas, which I'm guessing is a benefit in terms of being flammable, but we're also moving to air source heat pumps. So is there anything we should be looking at as local authorities, when we are starting to build and encounter developers who are building to much higher standards, that we should be aware of for fire safety? I mean, are there any greater risks? My feeling is probably there are fewer risks because we've got better built buildings with better insulation and thicker walls, but I say you're obviously the expert, so I'd be grateful for your views on that.
I think modern construction has certainly, in respect of firefighting, created more problems for us. However, fire safety, I think you will always have that element of human error and things going wrong. Modern building materials now are designed to contain insulation, you're right, the heat within the building itself. And I think in my experience, that just slows things down. You will still get those breaches. So, 30 minutes fire resisting construction, it will resist that fire, but what you need is some early warning. And if you've got just a smoke detector in the hallway, it may take a while for that early warning to be realised, and obviously the occupants of the house to make their escape. So in some respects, modern construction can be more of a problem than a fix. But I think if buildings are constructed correctly and they have the right fire, I suppose more active fire safety measures rather than passive fire safety measures. If they've got the right active safety measures, then that's going to save more lives than not.
Good question. Sam, would you like to come in and say anything? Or Heather?
No, just to say thank you for everything that you do. That's it.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was having unmuting difficulties, but slightly different perhaps. But at planning committee, we often get asked about access for fire vehicles when we're building. So I appreciate this is more of like a roads width issue than a house issue, but obviously, like you say, modern buildings creating more problems for you. Do you have any views about about road widths and whether more should be done? Do you find you often have problems accessing property. I say this from somewhere that's quite rural, so normally, you know, we're quite used to basically if you can't get a combine or a tractor through it, you know, you don't do it. But I appreciate that's not the same everywhere. And what we're noticing actually is, as our communities are changing, they're not bearing that in mind, and we are having situations where a convoy has to stop, knock on doors, get people out to move their cars. I'm just wondering how that impacts for yourselves.
It's quite frequent, actually. Certainly most existing developments, we do have a problem with parked cars, and it's normally parallel parking. But there's nothing we can do about that, really. It just slows us down in our response. But for planning a new builds, it would be very useful to be involved at a more earlier stage. You know, if we've got or we know there's a development that's going to be built where you've got quite a few houses, and I think what we've seen in my experience over the last few years, probably going back longer, is they try and cram in as many houses as possible on a very small piece of land, and that can affect access. Obviously, in our approved document B, there's requirements for the road has to be a particular width, you know, curb to curb. Has to be a hammerhead turning in roads of a certain length, in order to turn fire appliances around, or even high reach appliances as well. So I think we're kind of governed by that guidance. We can't stipulate anything further than that, unless, you know, us as a fire rescue service has an appliance that is bigger than the width as specified within ADB. We do have, probably maybe seen it over the last few weeks, that we now have the delight of 2 new turntable ladders in the service, one based in Cambridge and one based in Petersfield. And all of our letters that go back to the AIs or LABC have to, or we put on there the requirements. These are our high reach appliances. These are the widths, the length, the distances, the turning circle for these appliances. So any new developments must be able to cope with the size of that appliance. But unfortunately, with B5, which is the, as I mentioned, the regulation for fire service access and facilities, once a building or a development has been built, that's nothing in the fire safety order. We can't retrospectively go back to them and say, this is wrong, you need to change it, because in the fire safety order, all they need to do is maintain it. So hopefully going forward, there's going to be a review of the fire safety order where there'll be more emphasis on fire service access facilities. So it's really important for us to try and get that right at the design stage as well. So it does create a lot of problems going forward.
At Cambridge City, when it's become apparent that there is an access problem and the fire tenders wouldn't be able to get down, we've now got an informative that we add to the planning application, planning approvals, to make the point that that part of the building regulations has not been complied with. We can't refuse the application on that basis, but we want to bring it to the attention of whoever's going to be the inspector that there's non-compliance in that respect. So a private house with a narrow, very long drive, they can build that drive, but they'd need to put in a sprinkler system. And we try and do it with an informative. I think we're getting close to the end of this forum, and thank you very much, Wayne, for your really interesting presentation and questions. So I just